Last week, the National Association of Resident Doctors went on strike action following calls on the federal government to improve their wages and allowances. This week, members of the Judiciary Staff Union of Nigeria shut down judicial institutions across the country over unmet demands for financial autonomy from the government. Now, while the Academic Staff Union of Polytechnics embarked on an indefinite strike over the non-implementation of its demands by the federal government. These incessant strike actions beg the question, is this the only proven way for workers to get the government to accede to their demands? Here to speak more on this is Associate Professor at the Baze University, Abuja, Dr. Biodun Adeniyi. Good to have you join us this hour.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on.
Let's start by asking you three major critical sectors of the economy: the judiciary, the health, and education, going on strike concurrently. Are we getting to a failed state here?
Well, I'm not going to say we're getting to a failed state, but it's just very unfortunate, because strike was very prominent in the days, in the pre-independence days, when there were agitations, for improvement in the status, and the welfare of workers. And against that background, you could understand that in those periods, we're dealing with some much more vociferous kind of enemies. We're dealing with external forces, personnel, that were not necessarily original to us, people who were just concerned about exploitation. So it was okay if the workers those days, adopted the extreme means of negotiation like strike. It was okay, and of course, they achieved results, it leading to the attainment of independence. But in the post-independence period, you will have expected that being equal natives, being nationals, supposed patriots that we should all be, strike as an extreme form of negotiation should be something that should be a thing of the past, but understandably anyway. And we also understand that we also appreciate that we have limitations as a people. Our government has limitations in terms of being able to make workers trust them. Because of the absence of trust, because of the trust deficit that exists, workers also still resort to extreme form of negotiation, which strike ordinarily is. But the other thing we need to be bothered about is that, why can't we adopt other measures? Because strike is not the only way in which we can achieve our ends. There are so many ways to it. There are probably work to rule. There are discussions. So it just tells me that, we are failing at the level of dialogue. And ordinarily, dialogue, consensus building, is a much more modern way of negotiation. And hardly will you see strike, in some other civilized societies. The fact that we are resorting to it just tells me that something is wrong, with the progress that we are making, in industrial relations. Very unfortunate considering the losses that we encounter in all the sectors that are ordinarily affected by this incessant strike. So, but what to do in this circumstance is just to appeal to all the warring factions, but because we know that when two elephants fight, it is only the grass that suffers. It is the people at the receiving end of the services provided by these labor forces that suffer from this incessant strike. And of course, overall, it's not also good for our economy, a polity that is desirous of productivity and efficiency, and that is seeking to enhance, the well-being of its people. Government, in this circumstance, yes, we have two parties at war. The greater grace still lies on the government. Government still has, reasons to show the greater grace. Make some more concession, and in making those concessions, it's not just about mouthing them or pronouncing them. Be deliberate about implementing. I beg your pardon, about implementing. Some of these concessions, some of the promises that you give to these labor force, these labor organizations, be ready to implement the policies, the promises that you give to them. For resident doctors, they've been in the last 9 months or so, they've gone on strike like 3 times, which is very unfortunate. So it just tells me that, in the first and second strikes, one of the parties, and mostly government, did not show fidelity, to implementing the promises they made. So what happened? We understand as well that there could be complexities in government, but why can't they find ways around this complexity so that they can satisfy or meet the demands of resident doctors, considering the critical role they play, in ensuring well-being at the level of health?
But here we are, a situation where people who occupy very important parts of our society are having to and as you put it, having to adopt very extreme methods. As you say, usually striking is the very last point at which people would resort to once dialogue breaks down, once you've got to a stalemate between both sides. If we look at the resident doctors strike, for example, here, we know that Senator Chris Ngige, who is also the Minister for Labour and Employment, says that they shouldn't be striking anymore because their demands have been met. Are you able to offer a bit more clarity on that situation here? Because I think it leads to understanding where the contentious really is, whether or not it's we have these demands aren't being met, or whether it's we've already gone on strike, we came to the debating table, we had these agreements and they haven't been implemented. What is the case now as it pertains to the resident doctors?
Well, I may not be too much in the know with regards to specifics, but I do know that doctors are people who subscribe to the Hippocratic Oath, and of course, central to that oath is the preservation of lives, And of course, if life is not preserved, there cannot be humanity, there cannot be progress, in terms of having fit people that will sustain systems and societies. And of course, because of their training, you expect that they are ordinarily noble people, people who are principled, who are cultured, who shouldn't say yes where the case is no, or who shouldn't say no where the case is yes. People who shouldn't ordinarily come to public space and lie to us. So if government had been had shown fidelity to those promises, I do not see any reason why they will not come to us and say government has not done it. I'm aware that they've been complaining about hazard allowance during the COVID-19 period, not being paid, even if that allowance is inconsequential, 5,000 naira, for instance, per hour or so, it's not, even that, as small as that amount is, it wasn't still paid, which is very unfortunate, amongst other things. I will know the role they played in helping us to get through that dangerous time that is still around anyway, somehow. They were on the front line. We saluted them to some extent, and we saw how much salute, how much kudos they earned in other parts of the world. What we needed to do was just to emulate the kind of kudos, the kind of salutes, that they earned in other parts of the world, realizing that they were frontliners, they were people at the defense line trying to shield us from the punks of the pandemic. So I do not expect that they will come and tell us that government has not met their demands, if those demands have been met. And of course, government has this pattern, really, what my friend used to sometimes call governmentality. You just try to be impositional. You have your own way because you are the stronger of those parties. You think you can browbeat them back to work or just push your position ahead of theirs. So that mentality is always the problem, really, because if the parties are seen as equals, where there is a process of giving and taking, where you make some concessions, of course, there should have been a balance at the level of negotiation and understanding. But with what we have, I think the government has somewhat reneged again. That's why the resident doctors are back striking very unfortunate, and I don't know how well we can plead with them, to be considerate, because before they can function well as medics, of course, we know that their economics, has to be above average too, or even average. They have to be able to feed, and they're taking a lot of risk. Something has to come to mitigate the kind of risk they are taking, and what is it, if not remuneration? And those remuneration outlined, the least the government can do is just to be proper with implementation. So something is missing in the matrix, and that thing that is missing in the jigsaw is what we need to discover, so that we can solve the problem with resident doctors, Adefemi and colleague.
Indeed, something is missing. You mentioned the Hippocratic Oath, and the question to ask is, how can doctors go on strike, especially during a pandemic? Where is their compassion, and their duty of care? But with all of that, what should the government be doing? Should they be listening to all of this and preferring solutions?
Well, I think there's a difference really between morality and reality, between morality and economics. If we look at the moral aspect of it, we say they have a role to play, but for them to be able to play that role, they also have to feed. They also have to be alive to be able to play that role very well. And being alive is dependent on their resources, and that resources comes essentially from government through wages, through remunerations, through allowances. And if it is not coming as appropriately as possible, because at the personal level, you understand that they also have families. If it is not coming, of course, the humanity in them, or being humans, they are born to react, ahead of whatever oath, they subscribe to, being professionals. But it is what it is, and what government can actually do is not to rest on its oars. I know that sometimes government too is overstretched because of a lack of resources, because of multiple strikes. Polytechnic lecturers are also on strike, judicial workers are also on strike. But maybe some kind of a stronger, more matured mechanism should be put in place, on the part of government, to remedy situations before labor groups think of downing tools outrightly. I know there are ways in which government machinery, like I always say, is very complex, very, very strong, and whatever they want to do, they can do it if there's determination and if there's political will and if the leadership is focused, So government still has to show the greater grace, if I have to say this for the umpteenth time, and ensure that, look at the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is the preservation of lives, and the well-being of the people. And central to it is, healthcare delivery, and also equally central to healthcare delivery, are the roles of medical doctors, aside other professionals in that line.
I wanted to come in here and ask you a question about striking itself and whether or not you think it's lost its effectiveness over time. I mean, ultimately, I know that people resort to strikes because that's really what gets attention. If you've been sending letters and engaging in delayed conversations, ultimately, if you want a faster response time, definitely striking would be the answer. But I wanted to put to you whether or not you think that over time the effectiveness of strikes has waned at all, or whether or not you believe it's still just as effective.
Yes, Adefemi, strike is actually an extreme way of negotiation. It should actually be the last thing, in the chain, in the line of discussion. It just tells you that dialogue has broken down. It's like going to war. Ahead of wars, of course, we do see that people talk, people negotiate. But when negotiations fail, then you now take the last option, which is exchange of fire, or that's the light in which I want to see strike. But the fact that most of the time we are not able to explore all avenues, before the strike, every time.
Dr. Biodun Adeniyi, Doctor, we'll have to interrupt you there now. But do hold your thoughts. You're not going anywhere. We'll be back with you right after this break. You're watching The Morning Show. Stay with us. Glad to have you back. You're watching The Morning Show, and we still have with us Dr. Biodun Adeniyi in our studios. Good to have you stay on. Just before you went on break, we were still talking about the critical sectors of the Nigerian economy going on incessant strikes. Now let's look at students who throughout last year, lost so much coursework. and only got relieved when schools were opened. Now, unfortunately, they have to stay at home because their teachers, their lecturers have decided to keep them back at home. Now, the issue of ASU and the current ASUP now, that's the Academic Staff Union of Polytechnics, has been going on for quite some time now. And because you are in the academia, maybe you can help us better understand these issues.
Yeah, it's actually very painful when you see institutions that are supposed to render some kind of services, and in this case of ASUP and ASU, educational services being impeded by the absence of facilities and utilities. And it's much more unfortunate, when you see that it is possible for government, to make some more consequential intervention, in terms of the provision of resources for some of these facilities to be provided, for some of these utilities, to be provided as well. But when you see a reluctance, or inability or an unwillingness on the part of government, as is often alleged, to get some of these things done, it becomes very provocative, and you just believe that you cannot function fine, you cannot function at the optimum in providing educational services that you're supposed to provide. And of course, we know the importance of education to the development of human resources, to the enhancement of of skills, and the labor force overall, and for the overall development of the country. Critical sector, just like the health sector, and it takes us back again to the point we've always been making around the need for us to strengthen our institutions. And if we are strengthening our institutions, critical areas that will have to be bothered about remains the educational sector, the health sector, and the housing sector, the judicial sector. And these are sectors, where strikes are often seen, which makes it very, 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 very sad, really. I don't know what else to say other than to plead with authorities, to be much more forthcoming in terms of their responses. But overall, again, maybe we should come back again and talk to those who often think that they should go striking. It's a challenge, really. We understand the positions of those who are on strike, but maybe we should challenge ourselves again. If government is not forthcoming, what can we do as citizens, to remedy this situation so that those who are supposed to benefit from these services, are not left in the lurch, suffering and dying just like that, like Fela Nicola Pokuti we do. I remember very clearly as a doctoral student in England, our lecturers had to go on strike for some reasons, but this strike never lasted for more than 24 hours. And within that 24-hour time, you see them trying to hide, trying to give us lecture, continue with their lectures somehow so that we do not, for those 24 hours, we don't miss anything. So we're talking about commitment here, we're talking about process here, we're talking about concern for process for students and for their nation, as the case could be. So what can we do at our own level? Should we maybe do stage striking, before we go on general outright strike? Is it possible to talk to labor organizations to probably do it on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, rather than this long, unpredictable time in striking? Maybe we should challenge ourselves as citizens, not because we want to. Not because we are praising government. We're just looking. We're just necessarily looking at ways out of it in a situation where government is supposedly not responsive enough. Remembering the fact that we are all citizens of this country. When two elephants fight, the grass is always suffering, and when the grass suffers, the elephants, of course, eventually will suffer. So can we look at it from this general point of view? So that there can be a resolution to it at the end of the day. Going by my earlier point that strike is nearly obsolete, dated, antiquated, and shows that our ability to negotiate, our ability to be dialogic, is falling apart. And this shouldn't be the case in 21st century Nigeria, when nations are moving away from strike. There can also be some other ways, really, and that's the point I'm trying to make. Maybe we should challenge ourselves to look for other ways, if government is obviously not responsive enough.
Understood. I mean, even if you look at examples outside of Nigeria, I know that even when there's a Transport for London strike or train drivers are striking, you have a window where they let the public know this is what's going to happen. They give you alternative routes, but it's still definitely, as a consumer or a commuter rather, quite inconvenient when these things happen. And as you said, they don't last for very long and they serve their intended purpose. And I think that may be because there's a level of respect.
Absolutely.
People who are at the negotiating table ultimately have to have a level of respect for each other. I respect the job that you do, the role you play in society. I respect that comes with its own set of demands and economics, as you put it earlier on. Do you think that that's what's missing here in Nigeria, a mutual respect for different groups of workers in this country, back and forth?
I can't agree with you more, Adefemi, because strike is supposed to be a statement, but there are different ways in which you can make a statement, really. It could be by writing letters, by calling for meetings, consultation, because the end result is just to build a consensus, to come to an agreement. But when there's a trust deficit, there's an absence of mutual respect. Where one party thinks that it can law things or ride roughshod over the other party, then that party is forced. The other party becomes defensive and comes back with a deadlier force than it was in the first instance, and that's what we're always seeing in our own situation. First, there's an absence of trust. Again, mutual respect is absent, which is very unfortunate. And I do not believe as well that there are problems, some of these problems cannot be resolved, if there is a commonality of purpose, if the political will is there as well. It's just a matter of getting the directions right, because all the parties, the professional groups, are not necessarily impervious to reasoning as well. But of course, when they are pushed, by the pains from lack, you do not expect them to sit back when they have families at the level of, and when they have families, then they resort to morality, resort to ethics, and say, no, they have service to provide, so they are not going to down tools. They are downing tools, because they are being denied, and when they feel that they are being denied in a situation where they are seeing opulence, luxuriation being displayed in circles, it becomes much more provocative, and they come back at you with a greater force, which is something that can still be remedied, if we wear our thinking caps better than we're presently doing.
All right, absence of trust, failing at the level of dialogue. Let me ask you very quickly now, is the Nigerian government complicit in these strike actions? Very briefly, please.
Yeah, well, to the extent that they didn't prevent it, we can say that, yes, they are complicit, but they can take up the challenge again like they did in the case of ASU. They never rested, negotiating with them. They were very, very conciliatory, largely. The two ministers in charge of education were very matured in the way they handled it, So maybe the strategy, yes, it took long because of COVID, but maybe the strategy that those two ministers adopted in the case of ASU can also be adopted by the two ministers in charge of health, Then the place of the labor minister as well should also be examined. We need some much more conciliation, some much more elegant, salutary, decent pronouncements, not necessarily menacing, not necessarily authoritative, but words, that are helpful towards the fostering of understanding, not words that probably that tends to badger down the labor groups, because they are all equal stakeholders in the nation called Nigeria.
Dr. Biodun Adeniyi, thank you very much for your time. It's always great to see you on the morning show here, and thank you for your insight.